Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a question that's been, well, circulating quite a bit here in the Netherlands since 2020. Excess mortality.
Right. And excess mortality, just to be clear, is simply when you see more deaths than you'd normally expect, based on patterns from previous years.
Exactly. And initially, the obvious culprit seemed to be COVID-19. That made sense for the increase.
Sure. But then the strange thing was, even after the big vaccination push in 2021, this excess mortality, it didn't really go away. It lingered.
It stuck around. And that naturally led people to ask, could the vaccines themselves be playing some kind of role here?
Well, the official line from the main Dutch health bodies, RIVM, CBS, NIVAL, UMC Utrecht, their investigations, came to a pretty firm conclusion.
Which was?
They published reports saying there's no link, no
Yeah.
connection between the vaccines and this excess mortality. Actually, they reported the opposite, that death rates were lower among vaccinated people. That's the published story.
Okay, but the mission for this deep dive, looking at the sources you've shared, is to really get into the weeds of the data that led to those conclusions.
Exactly. To look closely at what the numbers showed when researchers really examined them. And there were some, well, surprising findings and some real challenges in just understanding that data.
It's about letting the data tell its own story, maybe a more complex one.
Absolutely. We're going to walk through how different groups looked at pretty much the same information and came away with very different reads on it.
So let's talk about the group that decided to take this closer look. Early 2024, right? An independent research team forms.
Yeah, folks like Professor Ronald Meester, Dr. Mark Jacobs, Bram Baker was involved too. They got some funding through crowdfunding, but also, importantly, from Zonwealth.
The same kind of public funding body that backed some of the official studies.
Exactly the same. And they set out to re-examine this whole connection, vaccines and excess mortality, using basically the same raw ingredients.
So the CBS mortality database, the vaccination database, the stuff the official bodies used.
Precisely. They weren't using some secret different data set. They took the official numbers and put them under, let's say, a different kind of microscope, asking if the story matched the raw figures.
And their initial analysis? What did it show? Because you said it was astonishing.
It really was. Looking at the raw data, they found this huge difference in death rates. Like, it appeared that unvaccinated people were dying at a rate almost 10 times higher than vaccinated people.
10 times.
Wow.
And not just from COVID.
No, that's the key thing. This was across all causes of death.
Yeah.
Everything.
Okay, hang on. That sounds off.
Right.
If you just take that number at face value.
Deeply illogical, yeah. Because think about it. If that were a real vaccine effect, it would mean the vaccine protects you almost instantly from, well, everything.
Like heart disease, cancer, accidents.
Exactly. All causes. And that protection would supposedly start like the day after you get the shot, even before your immune system has really responded to the vaccine itself. It just doesn't make biological sense.
So confronted with this massive, biologically kind of impossible-sounding difference, what did the independent researchers conclude?
Their takeaway was clear. This huge gap couldn't be a real effect of the vaccines on overall mortality. It had to be a sign that the data itself was seriously flawed.
Flawed how? Like distorted?
Yeah, distorted by what they called artifacts or biases within the data. The difference was just too big, too immediate, and too broad across totally unrelated causes of death to be genuine.
Okay, so they saw this distortion, but you mentioned the official institutions use the same data. How did they interpret this same apparently illogical finding?
And this is where it gets really interesting, according to the sources. The official bodies saw the same numbers, that same huge apparent difference, and they published it.
Published it as what?
As evidence, as proof of how effective and safe the vaccines were regarding deaths. They basically presented the artifact, the distortion, as the scientific conclusion.
So presenting the weird number as the reality of vaccine effects. Okay. What specific problems or artifacts did the independent group think were messing up the data?
They focused on two main possibilities. The first one is something pretty well known in vaccine research, the healthy vaccine effect.
Right. The idea that healthier people tend to get vaccinated first.
Exactly. People who are already quite sick, maybe near the end of life, are less likely to rush out and get a vaccine compared to healthier, more active people. So the initial group getting vaccinated might naturally have a lower death rate in the short term anyway.
That makes intuitive sense. You're comparing groups that aren't quite the same to start with.
It's a known factor, a confounder you need to adjust for. But the independent team felt that while this effect is real, it just couldn't explain the magnitude of what they were seeing.
Not that nearly tenfold difference.
No way. It was just too extreme for that effect alone to be the whole story, which pointed them towards the second potential problem,
Which one?
the misclassification problem. Basically, the hypothesis that people who were vaccinated were sometimes incorrectly recorded as unvaccinated in the main IVM database used for these analyses.
Okay, vaccinated people being counted as unvaccinated. Is there any evidence for that?
Well, a big clue apparently emerged from one of the official institutions itself, Naval. They had put out a report, found a calculation error.
An error someone else pointed out.
Yeah, researcher Marita Hond highlighted it publicly. So Naval corrected the error and reissued their report. And in doing so, they inadvertently released some extra, more detailed data.
And what did that data suggest?
It contained a really key finding relevant to this misclassification idea. It showed that for certain groups, especially older people, where a lot of the excess deaths were happening, a huge chunk of those listed as unvaccinated might have actually been vaccinated.
How huge a chunk?
Potentially as high as 75% in some of those key older groups.
Wow, 3/4. If that many people labeled unvaccinated were actually vaccinated, especially in groups with high mortality, what does that do to the statistics?
It throws everything off massively. It could completely distort the comparison. Think about it. If your unvaccinated group contains a large number of vaccinated people, especially maybe some who died shortly after getting vaccinated.
Then the death rate in the unvaccinated group looks way higher than it actually is for truly unvaccinated people.
Exactly. And the pool of genuinely unvaccinated people looks smaller. It could potentially explain that entire, huge, biologically weird difference they saw in the raw data. The comparison becomes completely unreliable.
Okay, so armed with this analysis, the huge illogical difference, the evidence suggesting significant misclassification, the independent researchers went to talk to the institutions, right? RIVM, CBS, LARIP.
Yes, they had a meeting described as quite a detailed scientific discussion lasting a couple of hours. They laid out their analysis, the artifacts, the whole issue.
And how did the institutions respond in that meeting?
Well, crucially, the source says the institutions agreed that the analysis itself was correct. Like, the independent team hadn't made mistakes in calculating what the raw data showed.
They agreed the numbers showed the tenfold difference,
Yes.
essentially.
Yes. But then comes the really critical part, according to the sources, what was said about the meaning of that data behind closed doors.
What did they acknowledge privately?
In that meeting, they apparently acknowledged the data had major issues, lots of uncertainty, lots of noise, as they put it. They explicitly agreed that based on that specific data set, you fundamentally cannot set a number on vaccine effectiveness or safety regarding mortality.
Cannot set a number, but publicly.
Publicly, the message was the complete opposite. Very firm, very certain. No link to excess mortality. Vaccines are safe and effective based on this data.
That's quite a gap between we can't actually quantify this reliably from the data in private and the science is settled in public.
It's what the independent researchers called a very disturbing discrepancy, presenting deep uncertainty as settled fact. It kind of goes against the grain of careful scientific communication, doesn't it? Being upfront about limitations.
Yeah, you'd expect science to be about acknowledging what you don't know or what the data can't tell you as much as what it can.
Right. And the irony pointed out in the source is that the independent group being cautious and saying, hold on, this data is problematic, we can't draw firm conclusions, gets pushed aside.
While the institutions making strong claims, apparently not fully supported by the acknowledged state of the data, are positioned as the authority.
It's a strange inversion, seemingly.
Okay, so to try and nail down this misclassification issue, the vaccinated being logged as unvaccinated idea, the independent team proposed a specific study with LARIP, right, the side effects agency.
Yes, a really clever, direct approach. LARIP had this list, about 700 reports of people who died sometime after getting vaccinated, reported between 2021 and early 2022.
So these are people known to be vaccinated, because the report was about their death post-vaccination.
Exactly. The proposal was simple. Take these 700 known vaccinated individuals who died and just check them against the main RVM vaccination database. How many show up correctly as vaccinated, and, crucially, how many show up incorrectly as unvaccinated?
That would directly test the misclassification hypothesis. What did LARIP say?
Well, initially they seemed interested, agreed to see if they could do the check. But then, rather suddenly, they pulled back and refused to do the study.
Refused. Why?
The source mentions a strained email from LARIP It apparently said that when they did a preliminary check to see if they could even find these 700 people in the RVM database, they couldn't link way more of them than they expected.
Wait, the fact they couldn't find these known vaccinated deaths in the database? Doesn't that actually support the idea that the database has issues, potentially misclassification or missing records?
You'd think so. That difficulty is evidence suggesting a problem. But Larup's conclusion was the opposite. Because they couldn't easily find them, they decided they couldn't proceed with the research to check their listed vaccination status.
That feels circular. The problem you're investigating makes the investigation hard, so you stop investigating.
It does seem counterintuitive. The source describes it as Larup basically slamming the door shut. They wouldn't do the study, and they also wouldn't share the numbers from their initial check, like how many of the 700 were missing from the RIVM database.
Even though that number itself would be really interesting, right, given LARP works in the public interest.
Absolutely. There's arguably a moral case for transparency there. Larup did offer an alternative reason. Maybe the people reporting the deaths got the vaccination dates wrong.
But the independent researchers weren't convinced by that.
No, they argued that people usually have vaccination cards, doctors would likely have access to correct dates, and most deaths were reported very soon after vaccination, making a date mix-up less probable, especially for such a significant event. The refusal to share their own preliminary findings certainly raised questions.
So considering all this back and forth, the analysis, the meeting, the LARP situation, how did the Dutch government handle it when Parliament asked about this independent research?
The response, according to the source, was pretty blunt. The state secretary essentially fully dismissed the independent findings regarding excess mortality in vaccines.
Just dismissed it. On what grounds?
He stated he was relying only on the 3 official studies, the ones from RIVM, CBS, NIFL, UMC Utrecht, which, as we've discussed, concluded no link.
Did he give specific reasons for dismissing the independent work? The source mentions some were flawed.
Yeah, several reasons cited were questionable, according to the source. Things like claiming the independent research lacked genre funding, which it did have, partly. Questioning its peer review status when the official reports might not have been fully peer-reviewed in the traditional sense at that exact moment either. And anyway, peer review location doesn't negate scientific content.
Also doubting the researcher's expertise.
Right, which seemed odd given their backgrounds. And finally, falling back on scientific consensus as a reason for dismissal.
Which isn't really how science works, is it? Progress often comes from challenging consensus with new evidence or analysis.
Exactly. The source paints it as an example of how critical scientific challenges can sometimes be brushed aside, maybe institutions protecting each other's positions once a narrative is set.
A reluctance to revisit conclusions, even when the underlying data seems shaky upon closer inspection, using standard methods.
It suggests a potential resistance to scrutiny, especially when a strong public position has already been taken based on that initial interpretation of the data.
Okay, so let's bring this back to you, the listener. Why does this specific, quite technical deep dive into Dutch data matter?
Well, first, it's a really clear case study. It shows just how tricky interpreting complex public health data can be in the real world, especially during something like a pandemic.
Things aren't always as black and white as headlines suggest.
Not at all. Data quality, those hidden biases or artifacts, the choices made and how you analyze it, all these things can fundamentally change the picture. And that matters because, well, COVID vaccines are still used, new mRNA tech is developing.
So understanding how we measure safety and effectiveness and potential problems is crucial for everyone making decisions.
Absolutely. For policymakers, yes, but also for individuals trying to make sense of health information. And it screams for better data systems next time, right?
Definitely. If the core database used for these critical analyses might have serious misclassification issues, that's a massive lesson. We need reliable data.
We really do. And then there's the trust issue, that gap between private uncertainty and public certainty.
That the source highlights. It damages trust in institutions like IVM, doesn't it? You see it in polls, maybe vaccine uptake for other things too.
Precisely. Rebuilding that trust needs more openness, honesty about the gray areas, the uncertainties inherent in science. People expect that now, not just pronouncements from an ivory tower.
They want to understand the why, the how, and maybe even the we're not totally sure about this part yet.
Exactly. That transparency is key.
So briefly, what are the independent researchers planning to do now?
They're not stopping. The plan is to keep digging, look for other data sets, maybe more NIFL data, other sources to try and shed more light on these issues, particularly the misclassification angle.
And how are they sharing their work given the challenges?
They've decided to use platforms like Substack to put their findings, their data, their analysis out there directly.
For transparency, so people can follow along.
Yeah, ensuring the information is accessible, keeping the scientific conversation alive, especially if, more traditional channels seem less open to this kind of critical look at established conclusions.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive really showed a complicated situation. Clear signs within the data itself suggested major problems, potential artifacts, misclassification, making firm conclusions about vaccination status and all-cause mortality pretty much impossible from that material.
Yet the official stance communicated publicly was very firm: no link. While the independent group highlighting these very data issues seemed to face roadblocks.
It's a stark reminder about data interpretation, institutional communication, and the challenges of scientific debate in the public square.
Definitely. It underscores the need for rigorous methodology, but also for humility and transparency when communicating findings, especially when dealing with uncertainty.
Which leaves us with a thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If the data underpinning really important public health guidance can be this complex, potentially flawed, and subject to such different interpretations even among experts, how do you navigate that? When faced with conflicting expert views or official statements that seem disconnected from underlying data uncertainties, how do you decide what information to trust? What level of openness about scientific limitations do you feel is necessary from our public health institutions to earn and maintain your confidence?